Hi, welcome to PolyTheism. My name's Sandra.
And I'm Justin.
And PolyTheism is a podcast at the intersection of sexuality, identity, relationships, and spirituality. If you're seeking a deeper spiritual connection in these areas of your life, we're hoping to be companions on your journey.
Whether you've been hurt by religion and are looking for healing, identify with a faith tradition and are looking outside of the box, identify as spiritual but not religious and want more, or are looking for meaning beyond what is in your life, we believe we can do this together.
Through love, curiosity, and wonder.
PolyTheism is a podcast about sexuality and spirituality, which means that we can cover some pretty sensitive topics. If you are listening and find anything that we're talking about to be triggering or hurtful or drawing up something that is feeling really tender, feel free to stop, seek help and assistance and love and connection. You can always come back to us.
And though Justin is a chaplain, neither of us are actually licensed therapists, so keep that in mind and seek professional assistance if you need it.
A lot of what we're talking about is from our own personal lives and experiences. We're hoping that you can connect with what we're saying and we can do this together.
And if you don't connect, take what you want, leave the rest behind.
That's right. We're really open to feedback. Let us know if we get something wrong. Neither of us are ever going to intentionally be hurtful or disparaging. At the same time, I know that I don't get things right, and so really appreciate when people can call me back into community, and yeah, we can make it right.
We're open to learning together.
That's right. So, Sandra.
So, Justin.
How you doing?
I'm doing all right. How's Seattle?
Seattle is beautiful today.
So is Portland.
Being in the Pacific Northwest, PolyTheism is being recorded on the unceded land of the Duwamish and Coast Salish peoples, here in perpetuity and still existing today. I mean, from what I know of indigenous spirituality, a lot of cultures have been open to different relationship configurations.
That's for sure.
Right, and especially when it comes to gender identity and sexuality, and, what we know now is there's the concept of being two-spirit.
I only know about that anecdotally, things that I've read on the internet, hearing about it on podcasts, that sort of thing. I haven't done any kind of study on it. Have you?
I only know from the people that I've encountered who identify in that way. And it's very similar to how a lot of our siblings experience their own gender and sexuality. Being in between spaces or feeling flexible or not identifying with any gender, and yet it's intrinsically part of how they know themselves and how they move throughout the world.
What an interesting way to start a podcast about the poly in polytheism.
And of course, the poly in polytheism in the name of the podcast really stands for, poly from the Greek meaning many, and polyamory being this idea and experience that we are not limited in our experience and expression of love.
So today we want to talk about what polyamory is, how at least we define it for ourselves, and then go into how we experience polyamory, how we got here, how we identify as polyamorous, and then how that relates to our spiritual experiences. So you want to start off with a little bit of a definition of what polyamory is to you, Justin?
Oh gosh, what is polyamory to me? That's a really good question.
Yeah, sometimes it's a little easier to define it by what it's not.
One way that I experience polyamory is that it is in juxtaposition to the concept of monogamy, which is very normal and exists in a lot of different cultures too. And it's this idea that two people are committed to one another and only one another for whatever time that they have together.
Yeah, I'm going to challenge a statement that you said. It's very normal. It's highly normalized.
Thank you. No, that's true. Deprogramming my own internalized normality, these internalized systems growing up in Western culture in the United States, in traditional Christian and Catholic spiritualities, I am still in many ways thinking and feeling and moving throughout the world with this idea that monogamy is normal, so I'm doing air quotes there, normal, and polyamory is somehow abnormal. What I do know, when I can kind of stop and reflect, is that monogamy, polyamory, all the different ways that people find love in relationships, all of that is normal. In many ways, monogamy is a social construct, and one that's kind of been embedded into our culture in many different cultures for millennia. And yet, when we look into the natural world, when we look at different species, when we look at life itself, there's diversity. I mean, what is normal?
Mm-hmm.
What is normal in life? Life perpetuates, certainly. That seems to be normal about life, but it perpetuates in so many different ways.
Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, I would even go so far as to say monogamy is a colonial construct, in that there are a lot of indigenous cultures around the world that, before they had any concept of what England was or what these other countries were or anything else, lived a life very, very differently.
Yeah.
And the concept of one person with one person only ever forever was strange to them.
Yeah.
When you think about it, monogamy, and there's a lot of great research out there. I'm not going to dig into all the research. Maybe if we do notes on these podcasts, we can put some of the books that we've read on this into that. But there's a lot of studies out there that show that when they started doing studies to talk about whether monogamy was normal, they would go into other cultures and they would look for ways to define relationships as monogamous. And they'd say, oh, this culture has a concept of marriage, when that concept of marriage was literally someone moving their hammock from one hut to another hut, ignoring the fact that 2 weeks later they could move it to a different one and no one would be upset.
Yeah.
So it's the same kind of concept. We have colonized the world and in the process brought cultural concepts that aren't necessarily quote unquote natural or normal concepts. They're just concepts.
Yeah. And and not to say that just concepts are kind of frivolous. I mean, these are the things that we use to live our lives, right? To experience love and connection and kind of create a meaning and purpose to what we're doing as human beings, right? These are really deep beliefs.
Yeah, to build structure and community, I would say. The difficulty is that structure and community also builds into it very specific biases.
Yeah.
And one of the most difficult ones for me to always overcome was that somehow or another women are lesser.
Yeah.
Monogamy really, up until incredibly recently, and I would still say even today, really identifies the woman as the lesser being.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of our culture and our political system and the way that our culture here in the United States supports men over women. Even now, men still make more money than women for doing equal work. And that's proven. It's not just like a culture war topic. When I look into the spiritual history of monogamy, especially from kind of a Western Christian perspective, and even going into pre-Christianity, into its Hebrew roots, and even before then, kind of from the Semitic Middle Eastern experience, women were property.
Mm-hmm.
And out of that experience of women being property came this spiritual notion of God creating men and women to be together, and yet still the man being the one on top and the woman being subservient. And just like in our American culture and our experience of slavery with African Americans and other peoples, our structures and our systems are still have these in them. And so that's something that I struggle with, and something that, coming back to our original question, how do I experience my own polyamory, is this acknowledgement that I don't want to live into a system that still subjugates other human beings.
Mm-hmm.
And so my spouse
Mm-hmm.
or you as my partner or, other people I might be connected with, I don't want to continue with this notion that the people in my life may be subservient to me, and that our institutions of marriage, that our institutions of love really still have this infection of ownership over our partners.
Mm-hmm. To go back to this, what is polyamory? Polyamory is defined, it is many loves. It means the ability and the freedom to love more than one person in the way that we have often defined a traditional man-woman relationship in the past. Now, of course, this also includes relationships between any genders of any type. And so it's really very open. It's really an incredible way of just looking at the ability to make powerful connections with other people that matter and that are at the same level as one would consider their spouse.
Yeah.
Or, maybe not. Some people have polyamory where they have casual relationships, where they have queer platonic relationships, where they have all manner of different ways of approaching it. It just means many loves.
Yeah.
And it really tries to, if you think about it on that political level, it tries to reclaim the idea of the importance of others in our life and the importance of building those connections with others in a way that is not defined by culture, but is defined by our own sense of meaning.
Yeah. And really rooted in consent and respect.
Yep.
Right. That's what I experienced from a lot of the polyamorous community that I've been involved in and have experienced from you, is that at its best, polyamory is rooted in the consent and respect between two or more people. Mm-hmm. And really gives the freedom and the options to love the way that we feel called to love naturally from our own experience. And that's how I experienced polyamory for myself. When I finally came into it a few years ago, it was mind-blowing, spirit-blowing. I mean, it allowed me to experience myself in a way that felt more natural than any other relationship experience, love experience, connection experience that I had before.
And all this sounds really high-minded. Boy, I'd love to say that I thought about this, that I came to a conscious decision and all of that, but that is just not the case. I experienced my polyamory as a function of my nature.
Yeah.
As you know, I was married when I was 18, lost my first husband when I was 22, and in that time period, even in that short time period between 18 and 22, he and I talked about, what in the 90s was called opening up our relationship, right? There really wasn't a lot of stuff out there about polyamory. There were books like The Ethical Slut, which were about ethical non-monogamy. But polyamory really was about, for me, recognizing that I could have an experience of deep love with more than one person at the same time. I didn't have to dump one to be with another because everyone was okay with it.
Yeah.
That was, again, it was mind-blowing to me, but I didn't recognize all of the ethical and cultural and political considerations behind it. I came to it in a very different way in that way. I felt very much like my own gender identity, like my own sexual identity, that being poly was a function of who I was. Being polyamorous was in my nature, not just a choice I was making.
Yeah.
And I think that comes into, we asked, this is something that I hear a lot, and I admit that it gets to me. Is polyamory a sexuality or is it a lifestyle?
Yeah.
And if you have been around the ethical non-monogamy space for a while, you'll know that ethical non-monogamy is a big umbrella over a lot of different ways in which people can have non-monogamous relationships. Mm-hmm. And one of those that people are really familiar with is swinging.
Yeah.
And that is partner swapping, it is having sex parties, it is a lot of other things. But there is a line between swinging and polyamory in that this swinging culture tends to not forge deep emotional bonds, fun emotional bonds.
Yeah. and even friendships.
Yeah, absolutely. But not the deep, like, spiritual connections that might come with polyamory or might come with other forms of ethical non-monogamy. When people refer to the lifestyle,
Oh.
I always think swinging.
Yeah.
Right? As a matter of fact, I have a friend that is a swinger, and she talks about LS all the time, lifestyle.
Lifestyle.
So now, with all of these new places where people are talking about polyamory, I'll get onto a polyamory place on Facebook or something along those lines, and somebody will come in and say, hey, I'm new to this lifestyle, and I'll go,
Oh, no.
just breathe. They don't mean anything by it, Sandra.
Yeah.
They don't mean anything by it.
Yeah, and in the polyamory spaces that I inhabit online and here in Seattle, it really is experienced as a spectrum. It's experienced as a spectrum. Some people do it because of the political, social implications. You know, they're kind of, fighting against the system and raging against the machine, and that's one way that they're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
Others kind of ebb and flow with it. Sometimes it's like, this is something I'm choosing to do. And then some days it's like, man, this really feels like I can't do anything else. And regardless of how people find themselves into ethical non-monogamy and consensual non-monogamy, it is kind of this, I experience this as a spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And for myself, polyamory really is part of my identity. When I look back into my life, into my preteens and tween and teenage years, monogamy never felt right to me.
Mm-hmm.
I found myself in relationships, in many ways became kind of a serial monogamist in my relationships.
Yep.
And yet, and that same time, always found myself being drawn to more than one person. Always found myself connecting deeply with other people and just wishing that it could be okay to be with these people and with the other people I was connected with. And yet I also had these cultural norms of monogamy and these spiritual religious norms of monogamy that was telling me that my feelings, that this draw, that this need to connect with many loves was sinful and wrong. And so I spent a lot of time trying to push it down, trying to purge it, because I really experienced it as a fault, as something that was unnatural and sick about me.
Yeah. Something that you needed to purge, right? That somehow it was not acceptable. And we are lucky enough to live in a time where people have started accepting other types of sexuality and even gender identity than before. Whereas, when I was growing up in the 80s, anyone who was transgender or who was gay or who was, anywhere in those spectrums would have been considered wrong and bad. And as a matter of fact, gender dysphoria and all of these, and sexual dysphoria, sexual problems in quotes, were part of the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistic Manual.
Yeah.
So homosexuality was still considered
a disorder,
right?
Yeah.
So I think in a lot of ways, we may not define polyamory in our culture as a disorder in the DSM, but we certainly, absolutely still look at it as somehow unnatural or not normal.
Yeah.
Which goes right back to what you were saying at the very beginning, which is why I had to call that out.
No, I appreciate that you did, because I believe that I need to dismantle a lot of what I've been socialized into.
Yeah.
I want to dismantle the normativities that are constructs rather than realities.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel that that helps me become a better human being and a better partner.
Yeah, it's something we talk about, Mm-hmm. I am lucky in that, again, I wasn't a serial monogamist, quite simply because I got married when I was 18, right?
Yeah.
So the first person I fell in love with is the person that I married. And when I lost him, I kind of buried the idea of being with anybody for a while. And then once I did, I knew that somehow or another, if something happened to my partner, I needed to be able to survive. I couldn't tie myself so exclusively to someone the way I had before. And so into that marriage, we went understanding. Oh gosh, I sounded like Yoda there. Into the marriage we went.
Into the marriage we went.
And
Lord,
yeah,
not. There is no
and
try.
leading up to the marriage, we recognized that we had to have separate and individual lives, and that was going to include deep and meaningful relationships with other people, and that we'd work on it together to figure out how to do it.
Yeah.
So that was my experience, and that was back in, well, I got married in 1998, so,
Woo.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It was a very different experience of marriage from what I can understand. People seem to be surprised by that approach. But again, people have been doing this since long before I was.
Oh, yeah.
You know?
Yeah, polyamory has been part of the historical record since prehistory.
Yeah.
What's that book, Sex Before Dawn?
Yeah, that's the book I was thinking of earlier.
Yeah, it really goes into the historical expressions of polyamory and non-monogamy for human culture and humankind.
Yeah, sexuality all around.
Yeah, and that even different primates, right, our different cousins, genetic cousins, experience a wide range of mating styles, of relationship styles, right? Why should we human beings be any different?
We are absolutely, as a society, completely obsessed with sex.
Yeah.
This is another thing that I want to say polyamory isn't. Polyamory isn't a whole bunch of sex all the time.
Yeah.
That's although, sex can be a defining part of a relationship, it is not even necessarily a part of a polyamorous connection.
Yeah. You and I experienced this in our own marriages. Right?
Oh, yeah, that's true.
And going back to this idea of like, how did we find ourselves here, right? Experiencing polyamory and living into polyamory. For myself, my partner and I had struggled with our sexual relationship and connection for years until they came out as asexual, on the asexual spectrum, which then felt like a huge relief, because at least it was like, oh my gosh, this makes sense. This really helps understand like what is part of the root of this dissonance in our relationship, right? We had emotional connection, we had aesthetic connection, we had spiritual connection, we had all these things, and yet this one component just seemed like such a struggle. Which then led me to looking at, okay, how do we continue together, them being on the asexual spectrum and myself being incredibly sexual, and these two pieces being inherent parts of our being? How do we be together in a loving and respectful and ethical and consensual way, which led me into looking into ethical non-monogamy as like, okay, what's a both and? How do I think outside of the box of being able to continue as my whole and true self and maybe not living a life where I felt functionally celibate or functionally pushing down a piece of myself.
Yeah.
And so in that search, in that, as kind of like a moment of, I got to find something that works here because I don't want to divorce my love and my partner, I kind of stumbled in to ethical non-monogamy and into polyamory. And as soon as I did it, as soon as I found it, it was like it was a spiritual experience. It was big, it was terrifying, it was awe-inspiring, and it felt so right. It felt so right.
We actually haven't had this conversation.
Yeah, we haven't had this conversation. It felt so right that I suddenly knew I could not go back. Right?
Yeah.
I crossed the threshold. I crossed the threshold.
That's when polyamory becomes an identity. Like, it is part of your sexual identity. And interestingly enough, side note, we might take this out, I don't know. I am also on the asexual spectrum. I consider myself demisexual. I'm not attracted to people based on their looks or their gender or anything along those lines. The attraction really comes with knowing the person. Once I'm there, I can be very sexual, but at the same time, even though I identify as polyamorous, there was a period of about 10 years that I didn't date anyone. I was still married, but my husband and I were functionally celibate as well. We both consider ourselves to be bisexual, omnisexual, pansexual. I don't know what the right term is anymore, and I'm not here to argue that, but his Kinsey scale has shifted as he aged into being more sexually interested in men. And so it's waned a little bit in his sexual interest with me. But the love, the affection, the care, the appreciation, everything that made us the partners that we are was still there. And I just wasn't interested in finding anybody else for about a decade. Didn't change the fact that I was polyamorous.
No. And we both found our way into this experience. You when you were really young, and me in my 40s.
Sometimes it might come across in these episodes as I'm like, oh yeah, it's so cool that you finally found this. And I'm not trying to do that. It's just that I have been in this practice. I have been openly polyamorous for 20 years, but I had the same experience the very first time that I had permission from the person that I was with to also be with other people and to love them the way that I wanted to love them. And I came back and I talked to my partner and I said, this is what happened with these people. And it was nothing but love. It was nothing but love.
Yeah.
I felt like I'd come home. Like I understood something about myself that I hadn't understood before. I just have more years of having that feeling. So I'm like, oh yeah, cool. It's easier for me to talk about.
I feel that everybody finds their way into their resonance, at many different times in their lives. And just like what you were saying about your spouse, is that sometimes that can ebb and flow. Mm-hmm. I do wish that I had known that this was an option for me when I was younger, but I'm glad I know now. And so right now, how do you experience polyamory spiritually, right? This is a podcast at the intersection of, spirituality and sexuality. So, yeah, how do you see polyamory in your own life as a spiritual expression, as a spiritual connection, as an experience?
Yeah, and this is where our roles switch, right? Where you have always had more of a connection with your spirituality. Mm-hmm. I have been lucky enough to come to a connection with my sexuality earlier. Mm-hmm. And so spiritually, I was very cut off for a really long time. I grew up in the Bible Belt. I had a lot of fear associated with it. My forays into alternative spiritualities outside of Christianity, the Christianity that I was born with, also didn't go well. And so I really just felt ostracized and like that wasn't for me. I just wasn't allowed spiritual experiences. So now I'm just coming to start understanding my sexuality as connected to my spirituality.
Yeah.
And that it is part of what I feel, that there is a transcendence connected to being in my sexual self.
Yeah.
So I would say, and I think actually you might have pointed this out to me, that my kinky side is definitely a part of my spiritual side. Now, loads of people have said this, and loads of people, like smarter than me, have written about this. But it was not something that I even thought about.
Yeah.
I even remember asking you, well, what does that say about my soul? And it says, your soul is spicy. And
your soul is spicy.
Right? Yeah, right?
Yeah.
But that there is a connection. And I've said this before. I feel sometimes in kink that there's a connection deeper than sex.
Yeah.
And I think what I mean is that there is a spiritual connection there. That souls touch in ways that they don't necessarily touch in other times. It's a place where we can be incredibly vulnerable and incredibly open. Mm-hmm. And I am just now starting to recognize that as a sexual sensation as well, a sexual experience as well. I don't mix my sex and my kink very much. I know a lot of people do. And so those had stayed separate in my head. Mm-hmm. So I would say that I'm learning how I experience polyamory spiritually.
Yeah.
What about you?
So for me, my sexuality and my identity as a bisexual or pansexual person, so somebody who is attracted to multiple different people regardless of gender, all of that plays into, as we talked about in the first episode, which is my existential and ontological and understanding of myself. And I love that you brought up earlier, it's like, that sounds so heady, but it's this deep emotional experience. When I am connected to somebody sensually and sexually, whether it is a friend or a lover or any configuration of that spark, that vulnerability, that you were mentioning, that connection, to me feels beautiful and wonderful in an existential way, meaning that I am living into this part of my incarnation. So this part of my being alive that is inherent to my being, which goes to the ontological concept. I don't feel like I can live a life without being sexual.
Yeah.
And that's my own experience, that my sexuality and how I experience sexuality is intrinsically interwoven into my spirituality, my physicality, my mental and emotional spaces, which doesn't mean that I go around wanting to hump everything.
Right. You're not always like, oh.
Yeah, it doesn't mean objectification, right? It doesn't mean that I am turning everything and everyone into a sex object. It just means that when I'm with people and people that I love, sometimes and often I will feel a sexual attraction. Now, that also doesn't mean that I have to act on it. Often that I don't, because I also recognize that sexual attraction is not returned, it's not reciprocated, and I experience my sexuality as wanting to be rooted in consent and respect. And yet, I have the experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so with polyamory, I feel like I have the freedom to sexually, spiritually experience the loves in my life through touch, intimacy, connection. You and I, in our sexual relationship, I would call it's very spiritual.
Yeah, I think so too.
Right. And aside from the orgasms, just touching each other, right? Kissing each other. Those moments before, during, and after where we're looking into each other's eyes and connecting, right? To me, that is a sexual, spiritual experience.
Mm-hmm.
And gosh, our physical experience, or my physical experience of sex and sexuality is like everything is dialed up to 11.
Mm-hmm.
And that's so wonderful. But then again, I'm also a person. It almost seems to be my nature to want to dial things up to 11 in some points, whether it's my love of spicy food.
Oh my God, you should see his hot sauce collection. Oh my God.
Oh my gosh, it's ridiculous. Or how I drink my coffee, which is generally like strong and black, and just wanting to dive into just the deep flavors in that.
Mm-hmm.
Or even how I enjoy working out, which is sometimes I really want to just be as sweaty and as exhausted as possible.
Mm-hmm.
Because it feels like being alive.
Yeah. This is a place in which you and I connect, in that like both of us really like intensity.
Mm-hmm.
In conversation, in food, in sexuality, in experiences, all the way around. We just really like intensity. But I do want to just come back around to the audience here and note, this is us.
Yeah.
Maybe your spirituality is comfort and peace and joy.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe your connection is soft and vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
So please don't think that there's a right way to do this. How would we maybe recommend people start thinking about their own potential polyamory?
Gosh, how would people start thinking about their own potential polyamory?
Or polytheism.
Or polytheism. For me, I believe it begins with, in the spiritual world, we have this word that we call discernment, which is an intentional process of seeking our own truths. regardless of kind of where those end up or where those come from. But it's the process of really digging deep into one's being to really find one's path. And I would say if for people who are looking into polyamory, or people who are polyamorous and looking for a deeper spirituality within their polyamory, or people who are just looking for something different, I would say begin the process of discernment. And that can begin with asking questions of oneself, digging deeper into those questions, like, how do I experience sexuality? How do I experience being in my body? What emotions am I experiencing right now? What emotions do I want to experience and haven't experienced?
So many people walk into polyamory thinking, I just want another person. I think it would be fun to have another person. And there's nothing wrong with wanting fun and wanting enjoyment and all of that. But really, I think that discernment is a really good way of approaching this. Think about, why do I want this?
Yeah.
It may not be a spiritual connection that you're looking for. And that's okay. Yeah. Like, have fun. Go out, enjoy, experience other people's bodies. Love that. But there is a difference between doing that and connecting vulnerably and spiritually. And those are two different things, and they can clash pretty awfully.
Really just consent, respect, and that means consent and respect over myself, so ourselves individually, and with the people who we are connected with.
Yeah, so if you think you might be a polytheist, start by asking yourself those questions. What am I seeking? Why am I seeking it?
Yeah.
What are the experiences that I feel like I am missing or that I need to feel whole in myself?
Yeah.
And that should get you going.
And that begins the journey. And it's the journey that gets us to where we are, right? It's about the journey, not the destination, is what sometimes popular culture might say.
But it's true, right?
It is. It so is.
Something earlier, this comes from my 12-step program, and I think it's worthwhile to bring up here. One of the things that we say that are the promises of this program is that we will not regret the past, nor wish to shut the door on it. You talked about, gosh, I wish I had known this earlier. I wish I had had spirituality earlier, but you know what? I have it now. And not having it before gave me the means by which we have connected.
Yeah. And I wouldn't change that. All of us are where we are, and it's up to each of us to, with joy and with love and intention, to then choose in this moment, how will I be?
I can't think of a better way to end this one. Thanks, Justin.
Thank you, Sandra. And to everybody who's listening, thank you for joining us for another episode of the PolyTheism podcast. I'm Justin.
I'm Sandra.
And go out to love and serve yourself and the world.